Thank you, Tariq, and thank you very much to the organizers for this opportunity to speak today about the review conference. It's really an honor to share the panel with these distinguished speakers. I must confess in a conversation with a friend the other day, I had to describe my condition as something of a post-REFCON stress disorder. And I didn't even have to negotiate, so my sympathies are to those diplomats who were there, and some of you are in the room. Almost 6 months afterwards, it still all looks very foggy, and there's a bit of a bad taste after the review conference. And a lot of the reasons for that have already been covered by Ambassador Lagner. I will try not to repeat too much of what he said and highlight some of the observations from the REFCON. As was mentioned, the central debates, the central two issues for the review conference were going to be, and indeed turned out to be, the Middle East and nuclear disarmament, neither of which was surprising, and indeed nuclear disarmament has always been the central topic for the review conferences. It was one of the reasons we even have the review process built into the NPT structure in the first place. Middle East stole the show in the end from nuclear disarmament, becoming sort of the main reason the document was not adopted, at least on the surface of it. But throughout the conference, the Middle East discussions were taking place primarily behind the scenes, and most delegations and civil society were unaware of what's going on, how close we are to a possible solution, and that actually played into this final day dynamic about whether or not we will actually adopt a final document. And at least from the outside, it seemed like we were very close to having a consensus, even given the widespread unhappiness of non-nuclear weapon states with the draft presented by the president. While the Middle East the Middle East discussions were taking place in the shadows, the disarmament debate was front and center throughout the review conference, and in particular the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons and related issues to that of the risk of use of nuclear weapons, accidental or otherwise, proposals to begin negotiations, or at least somehow substantively and seriously discuss options for a legally binding instrument to implement Article 6 of the NPT, as proposed primarily by the New Agenda Coalition, but also supported by a large number of non-nuclear weapon states active in the humanitarian initiative. And debates, as Ambassador Lagner said, were hard, both substantively and atmospherically, and highlighted the divisions, quite profound divisions among member states going into the review conference, and those divisions became only worse during the review conference. And those divisions were not just because just between nuclear and non-nuclear weapon states. It wasn't your kind of classical divide. There were very serious disagreements among the non-nuclear weapon states, among different groups. Very often it fell along the lines of US allies or nuclear umbrella states versus the rest, but even within the rest group, you could see fractures forming, and as the conference went on, those fractures, I think, were becoming bigger, and about 6 months later, that I think, is presenting a serious problem to some of these groups. What were the main points of contention? As mentioned before, large gaps in perception of urgency of nuclear disarmament. Completely polar different views from a number of states. Large majority of states sought a recognition that the humanitarian impact and humanitarian discourse indeed lends much greater urgency to nuclear disarmament measures than we've previously thought, and that indeed humanitarian dimension should underpin all nuclear disarmament discussions and measures. The nuclear weapon states, in their fury, as Tariq said, disagreed, some ferociously, some less so, with the importance of the humanitarian dimension to the nuclear disarmament measures discussion, to the centrality of this topic to the future discourse, with there being any serious risk of accidental use of nuclear weapons, and of course with the existence of the so-called legal gap and the need to close it with some kind of a new instrument. So nuclear weapon states demonstrated a decidedly different perception of urgency of nuclear disarmament, and I think that was the deepest wedge between the countries. This was all exacerbated by the minimum results coming out of the P5 process over 5 years, and with the nuclear arsenal modernization programs in every nuclear weapon state, And also recent national pronouncements about the centrality of nuclear weapons, the value of nuclear weapons to the nation's security and sovereignty. So all that was really sending a bad message to nuclear weapon states. And on the issue of the misplaced comma or disputed comma, it was evident that the Russian Federation was not quite past that debate yet, because they insisted that the orphan child of the NPT is the general and complete disarmament, and that's what we really should be focusing on, so that didn't help the debate at all either. And as the conference went on, and there were no points of connection, it seemed like we as an NPT community came to a certain breaking point, a point of no return where disarmament debates moved well beyond familiar ground of discussion about the next step, incremental step, and its relevant, its relative priority or significance, and firmly placed ourselves in the area of profound disagreements on the very legitimacy of nuclear. Me too. So we moved basically from the discussion of what should be the next incremental step, is it FMCT and what's the scope of FMCT, things like that. We moved into the area of profound disagreement on the legitimacy of nuclear weapons as a national or international instrument of security, and related to that, of course, the very legality of nuclear weapons. So you had a lot of debate concentrated on whether or not nuclear weapons are legitimate at all. And that is the kind of gap that is significantly harder, if at all possible, to bridge with however skillful diplomatic language you can craft. That is a philosophical disagreement that you can hash over with good enough negotiations in the back room. And so it wasn't too surprising that the focus group on disarmament that negotiated separately in the Algerian mission in the end couldn't agree on anything. And as Ambassador Lagner pointed out, the document that came out of the president of the mission by the president was not a product of consensus. It wasn't a product of agreement. It was an attempt at sort of a best guess of where states could meet. There was widespread dissatisfaction with the text, particularly on how the humanitarian dimension was dealt with, and the language on the establishment of an open-ended working group that could potentially deal with the question of, do we need a legally binding instrument to implement Article 6 or some kind of other measure. Nevertheless, notwithstanding that disagreement and dissatisfaction, it seemed like we were this close to actually having a document. And because the burden of blocking it seemed to have rested on non-nuclear weapon states, on those who were unhappy with the text. And for all the dissatisfaction, it looked like the non-nuclear weapon states were not in a position to block the text. Middle East, as I mentioned before, was part of the reason. Because of lack of information, it seemed to many non-nuclear weapon states that some kind of a solution was at hand, that it wasn't clear that the United States was unhappy enough with the draft that it was prepared to reject it. And so that wasn't clear until the very end. And a number of non-nuclear weapon states seem to have had instructions not to wreck the conference if there is a Middle East solution. More broadly, however, this situation demonstrated that there are still very high political costs to blocking consensus at a review conference, and most non-nuclear weapon states are not prepared to pay that cost, individually at least. And there was one ambassador who summed it up beautifully, and he said that there are very few of us in the room who can say that we find an outcome unacceptable at any cost. So that pretty much summed up the position of many non-nuclear weapon states. And despite all the momentum generated behind the humanitarian initiative, that group was still not able to organize some kind of collective action to together to block the adoption of the text that they didn't like. So they needed a leader. Yeah. That raises, I think, serious questions about the future of the humanitarian initiative and its potential to pursue measures that they seem to want to pursue, at least the major actors want to pursue, and implications for measures like the open-ended working group and what it could achieve and what it could discuss. And so far, we seem to have no bridge builders. The debates at the first committee that just concluded were very much the continuation of the situation from the review conference and exacerbated in many ways and highlighted in many ways all the divisions that started to become obvious at the review conference. The middle ground right now looks like a wasteland or sort of a masked minefield, enter at your own risk. Japan kind of learned it the hard way, stepping into it, trying to build some bridges, and getting sort of slapped on the wrist for including the humanitarian dimension in their resolution that used to be kind of the most supported one on nuclear disarmament. So where do we go from here, and what are the implications? Well, there are some implications for the review process in particular. If we have indeed reached the point of incompatible positions, how do we come back from there to the next review conference? Do we simply hope that this will all blow over and the humanitarian initiative will dissipate and we'll pretend that we can go back to the business as usual of discussing incremental steps? Should we do that? Is that the solution for the regime? And if we cannot come back from that point, what is the meaning of the review process where you come in divided and you come out equally divided or even more divided? What does that do to the credibility of the treaty and the review process itself? What are the implications for the long-term participation of non-nuclear weapon states in the kind of process where they know they're not going to get anything out? And as Ambassador Lackner said, there is this opportunity now with the open-end working group. There are also risks. The resolution was adopted among great acrimony and disagreement about what the open-ended working group should do, what kind of mandate should it have, whether it should operate by consensus. So now there's a risk that once it convenes, it will get bogged down in deciding exactly that. What are we going to do? Are we going to try to negotiate? Which topics are we going to cover? Before it even convenes, the question is, will the states that abstained ultimately decide to participate? Because these are a lot of the US allies that do talk about the need to find this middle ground and bridge the differences, or at least have some different perspectives on nuclear weapons and their legitimacy. Will the nuclear weapon states, at least some of them, reconsider their position and participate regardless of having voted against the resolution? And if they decide not to do that, as they did with the previous open-ended working group, then what else do we have? And so far, I don't have anything optimistic to say, except to call on those who abstained, voted against, to consider participating and not treat the rules of procedure as a threat against their national security, and also highlight maybe the opportunity for civil society to have an input into how the open-end working group is structured, what kind of issues it addresses, and the manner in which it can do so. On that note, I think I'm over time. Thank you.